Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of 2025. Glad to have you on board. Our subject of the day is maximizing business outcomes through cloud agility. We will explore strategies and real case examples around business through cloud agility. I'm Andreas Abi Khalil, Partner and Program Manager at Ampy Solution, and your moderator for the day. Before I hand you to today's presenter, I would like to mention our rules of engagement for this webinar. This webinar is recorded and will be available on demand. If needed, please reach out to your partner or direct contact on the team to gain access to it. For questions, please leverage the Q&A feature in your top toolbar. We will dedicate time at the end of this webinar to answer them. Our featured speaker for today's webinar is Joseph Khalaf, the president of Ampy Solution. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. And today we're going to talk through maximizing business outcomes through cloud agility. The one thing I would like to mention here before I share my screen is that when we're talking about cloud agility as a Microsoft partner, we're talking about Azure specifically here. We're not going to cover the rest. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about potentially could be applied to other cloud providers, but the focus here is Azure and the benefits of Azure. So let me go ahead and present here. All right. So maximizing business outcomes through cloud agility. So this is a bit of an agenda of what we're going to talk about. So what is cloud agility? Does it mean cloud only? For me to be agile in the cloud, do I have to be fully invested in the cloud? We'll talk about some real case examples of cloud agility and what we could do and how we extend workloads. We'll talk about migrating workloads to be cloud native. And then we're going to close that out towards the end with sort of the big conversation that's happening today, where a lot of our customers are coming to us with these questions, which is the VMware pricing dilemma, and how can I get from that to a Microsoft developed model, and what are my options? And we'll talk about the three various options of how you could get from VMware to a Microsoft hosted solution. Okay, so cloud agility, the myth versus the reality. So do I have to be all in to be agile and leverage the cloud? That's a myth. No, you don't. You don't have to be all in. Workloads should live in the cloud, but doesn't mean all of your workloads have to be in the cloud. Customers can be agile, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, by implementing a hybrid model, by living in sort of two worlds. They could still be invested in their on-premises solutions. They could still be building additional maybe on-premises compute, but they could and should also leverage cloud for that extensibility, for that agility, for that disaster recovery, thus not having to invest more and more in on-premises assets and all that comes with the cost of that hardware, support, etc. Right? Cutting edge. Can I be cutting edge if I'm not all in the cloud? The reality is that probably not. At least from a Microsoft perspective, what we know and what we see is a lot of the cutting edge innovations that are coming to market. AI is the first one that comes to mind, Copilot, right? And various other technologies that are coming to market. The investment is not to build these on top of on-premises products or embed them in on-premises products. The investment is all in the cloud. If we look at Copilot, you have to be in the cloud. There are a number of other services that we obviously do a lot of work with. The Power Platform, right? The majority of the Power Platform innovation is happening in the cloud. You have to be invested in the cloud. So if you really want to be cutting edge, if you're that innovative, you definitely have to start shifting your focus over to the cloud for that agility, right? business continuity in general, right? Make sure that my technology is continuous and I don't have downtime. I minimize my downtime. The myth is that you could only have continuity in the cloud. That's not true. Continuity has always been around. It could still exist with on-premises. You could still extend your assets in a on-premises and ensure that you have continuous business operations, right? The reality, though, is that if you implement that continuity in a cloud model, aka a bit extensible in the cloud, then you are actually, and it's well designed, you will significantly improve your uptime and scalability, right? And done right, you will save money. If you're extending your compute and your resources the right way over to the cloud, there are numerous models within Azure today that will provide that, but also provide it in a bit of a passive model where you're not that spending money continuously because those resources aren't necessarily needed continuously. They're only needed during a disaster. The economics of cloud agility. So there is a huge myth out there that if you grab your workloads and move them to Azure, you will save money. That is absolutely not the case. You will not save money by doing a sort of brainless lift and shift to Microsoft Azure. If you are going to leverage Azure as your data center, you will not save money. Lifting and shifting compute and virtual machines just with reckless abandon up to Azure is actually more expensive than keeping them on premises, more than likely, or moving them to a colo at a data center. The reality, though, is that if you modernize these workloads to be cloud native, and what I mean by cloud native, meaning microservices native, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you will definitely save money. You will definitely be more scalable. You will definitely scale up and out. And you will be more redundant, and the list goes on. The benefits are incredible if you go to that model, but you have to redesign your workloads and your applications, and it doesn't necessarily have to be for some roles and some applications. The redesign isn't that much of an undertaking. It could potentially be a minor update or a minor shift, but you have to move into the cloud native microservices that are offered in Azure and not traditional virtual machines running in Azure. Security. When it comes to security, it's a myth that applications inside your firewall are inherently safer. That's not the case. It's psychological. Yes, I understand that psychologically, when you are behind a wall, you feel that you are shielded from the outside world, but that's just not reality. You can't operate in a world where you live inside a wall and nobody is allowed in. All businesses must have some sort of external collaboration model. And the mere fact that the psychology is that I'm behind a firewall, actually we see exposes more of our customers to more security holes than it actually protects them. The reality is that cloud applications are safer by design. And I'm not suggesting that any application you just, light up in the cloud is immediately locked and nobody can get to it. No, that's not the suggestion. The suggestion is that the reimagining and overhaul of security in cloud workloads and Azure services are designed to ensure that all of the levers are available to you to lock it down and prevent and mitigate any sort of attacks against your applications and your workloads. And the fact that you have these tools at your disposal and that you are starting to think about it because it's in the cloud versus behind a firewall, we see that most of our customers are actually becoming more thoughtful about security first, where before in the old days and even today, security comes second because you believe that firewall is your security and is your shield. That's definitely not the case. You have to be thoughtful about it. And finally, productivity, that's a reality. yeah, there are a lot of applications on premises for productivity, but today in an interconnected world, when you're dealing with external customers, just external forces in general, we're no longer bound by our offices. We work with customers. Um, all SaaS solutions are going to be by design way more richer, at least from a productivity perspective, more easily accessible for end users, and just simply designed for that in general. Okay, so let's talk about the first thing we talked about. Do you have to be all in to be agile? And this slide will talk through the fact that you don't. So let's talk about a couple of things, and we're not going to cover every single Azure service that's available out there for extensibility or for agility as a hybrid model, but we'll talk about some of the services that we see that you could easily get to without a lot of fanfare, without a lot of investment. So recovery, Azure Site Recovery. What we're seeing today is that most of our customers that are requiring recovery for their system in case of a disaster, and recovery doesn't always necessarily mean a disaster strikes. Recovery could also sometimes potentially mean that I want this scalability on demand. Azure Site Recovery is a great example of our customers coming to us and saying, we have on-premises workloads. We want disaster recovery and site recovery in general for these workloads, but we don't necessarily want to go out and buy a one-for-one for every single workload we have. If I have a SQL server, I don't want to buy another SQL server and put it in some data center across the city or across the state as site recovery. If I have any kind of server, if I have a BizTalk server, if I have any sort of a workload, I don't want to invest in that. What can I do to make sure that I am disaster proof without having to invest in that? And Azure Site Recovery is the answer to that question, which is you could take your existing workload on premises and you could extend them in Azure, and you could set them up in a on-demand or a passive standby mode, and they could be there. They don't have to run 24/7. Obviously, they have to run at some sort of a meaningful cadence to be able to make sure that we're synchronizing the workloads, right? You can't just turn them off because your workloads on premises are obviously alive, right? They're live. They're continuously being updated. So we can have a model where all of this stuff lives in Azure. It is being synchronized with your on-premises assets, and at the either through automation or with the flip of a switch. If something happens to your on-premises infrastructure, if there's a disaster where your colo is or where your server room is located, you can immediately cut that over to Azure Site Recovery and have, anywhere between minimal to no downtime whatsoever and redirect everybody to that site recovery. You could fail over, and then when your site comes back, you could also immediately fail back to your on-premises assets if you choose to do so. So that is agility without having to be all into the cloud. So intelligent traffic management, that's another example. We have customers that come to us and say, we have an application, whether it's homegrown or not, right? It's an application that we use. It's an application that runs the business. It could potentially be an application that our customers also use, that they get on, whether we have a customer-facing portal or what have you. And we are hosting this application on our assets. But there are, for example, seasonality, where sometimes traffic spikes up and we have to stand up more infrastructure to be able to meet the demand. Think of if you're a shopping, think of yourself as a mini Amazon, right? And during the holiday season, the requests to your applications are going to spike up. Do I always have to be invested in standing up more infrastructure to accommodate, Cyber Monday or Black Friday or whatever that seasonality might be? And the answer to that is no, you don't. You could have the baseline living on premises. You could have your baseline be living, inside your infrastructure that meets your daily routine, predictable demand. And then you can actually replicate those workloads, that application in Microsoft Azure, and build a traffic manager to where intelligent traffic management to where when there's a spike in my on-premises application and infrastructure can no longer handle all that traffic and all these transactions that are coming to me, I can have that Azure Traffic Manager start redirecting these requests over to the Azure, to the application running in Azure. And you could set it with rule, it could be rule-based, meaning please don't send these requests over to Azure unless my on-premises assets are tapping out and saying I can handle no more. And then when these requests decrease and they drop and there's no longer that seasonality, you could pretty much not sunset, but put Azure back in a dormant state and not have to spend all of that money on all of that compute up there. So the last one, which is probably the most familiar, where people don't think much about it when it comes to cloud agility, is identity. This is probably the most common. We do this every day. Probably all of our customers are already there, and there's probably a very good chance you're already there. But it does also apply to the cloud agility model, and I don't have to be all in up there, right? Identity, we're talking about Entra ID, we're talking about app provisioning, we're talking about the good old Active Directory. The majority of our customers that have been in business for a long time, that came up through on-premises technology decades and decades ago, do have Active Directory on premises and do have applications that require Active Directory on premises, whether they're legacy applications or whether the application, the ISV has not updated these applications to leverage cloud identities, doesn't really matter. What matters is that I cannot get rid of my on-premises identity. But as I purchase and as I invest in more modern applications, those modern applications require cloud identities and not on-premises identities. And this is where the hybrid model comes in. This is where Entra ID comes in, where if the identity provider for the application is Entra, then it just connects to Entra to provide the identity authentication. And if it's not, if it's using its own, this is where app provisioning comes in. For example, one of the more familiar brands out there for that hybrid model is Okta. Okta is very well known for that. Well, while Okta is a great product, but as a Microsoft partner, our focus would be to leverage native applications or native competitive services that are Microsoft developed. This is where app provisioning comes in. This is where an application leverages single sign-on or seamless sign-on and can actually decide whether to go to Entra. You can actually decide, do I want Entra ID or do I want Active Directory to be the identity provider for me? The beauty of this, and we're seeing this across many other applications, and it's becoming more and more common. NetSuite, Workday, all of these applications that are out there that require identity, that they could potentially be their own identity provider, are integrating with a lot of these extended other identity provider through a middleman identity manager. And the beauty of this, when you have that single source of truth, whether you're leveraging Entra ID as your source of truth or Active Directory as your source of truth, and you're synchronizing it with Entra ID, the beauty of this is that as you build app provisioning across on-premises and cloud, regardless of where your application is, your onboarding and offboarding costs decrease significantly because it's one user across the whole ecosystem, right? If I offboard that user in AD, that user will immediately get disabled or offboarded, whatever the rule is that you build into app provisioning. They are no longer able to access NetSuite, or they're no longer able to access Workday. So example number 2, which is, what if I want to be all in? and we are huge proponents of everybody being all in, but we want our customers to be able to take it at their own pace. But if you want to be all in, the idea is that you don't lift and shift. There is no, while there might be immediate value because of whether timing or because of some scenario that is specific to our customers, there might be value in saying, look, listen, I need to grab my assets and shift them to the cloud as a lift and shift. I don't have time. We get it. We are here to support our customers with that. But to truly show a return on investment and to realize savings over time, the right way to move over to Azure, the right way to be cloud agile is to actually leverage the Azure native services that will replace and modernize your old traditional, I have a virtual machine with an application running on it. And the list is extensive here, and I didn't obviously list them. If you look at the list of all services in Azure, we could be here for a week. There's plenty of them. But I listed the ones that we see the most often, where most of our customers, it's sort of like the easiest way to start. It's like a the appetizer before you get to the main meal of what you could do in Azure. Azure App Services. So this is your PaaS solution where if you have applications running, compiling, if let's say it's a web application running against Internet Information Services, and you have all that infrastructure that you have to manage to run that application, you could stop worrying about this. You could, depending on obviously the application, but you could easily convert that or recompile that or migrate that over to Azure App Services. It becomes a platform as a service, and you run your application up there. It provides incredible benefits, auto scaling, scaling up, scaling out, geo redundancy, traffic management, you name it. It is a lot easier with the click of a button to just make that application as robust as possible. So you, the customer that owns that application, could focus on developing and improving on that application. SQL. SQL is another one. Azure SQL is the same engine. It's no server maintenance required. It's the database engine running in Azure just as the engine. All you need to worry about is your database. Your only concern is your data source. You don't have to worry about a DBA tweaking SQL and making sure it's running okay. And I'm getting way too many requests. We need more hardware, and we need to build the cluster, and we need to do that. Everything within Azure SQL is what SQL Server used to be, except it's the click of a button versus all that complex SQL Server management. It's a fully managed platform as a service, and that's Azure SQL. And Microsoft also offers what we call lowercase IaaS, instance as a service. So you can get your own SQL instance, just like the old days where you built your own SQL instance. But what you're doing here is you're getting a little more dedication. Instead of just the database, you're getting the whole instance as a managed service up in Azure. Intune, that's also a very, even though that's not necessarily just strictly Azure, a lot of our Microsoft 365 customers are starting to look at Intune and invest in Intune. The Intune is, I don't want to really go all out and say it's the replacement of SCCM. It's not. SCCM still has value, but for customers that are starting to look at moving over to cloud managed device management, and I call it MEDM here because it's mobile device management, and I don't want people to think it's only for mobile devices. It's endpoint device management. So it's managing Mac OS, it's managing Windows, it's managing other operating systems, which includes iOS and Android, right? But now you are, if you're not in SCCM, if you were never in SCCM, you actually have a mobile and endpoint device management solution at your fingertips to be able to manage those devices. It's mobility simplified. It's designed for a mobile workforce because it's sitting out there. It'll manage your devices wherever they might be. As long as they have an internet connection, the device can be managed. And for lack of a better term, it's endpoint agnostic, right? If it's Windows, if it's Mac OS. Obviously, to be fair here, for example, there are third-party products out there that you could also invest in, like Jamf, that will sit on top of Intune and that will do a better or a more advanced job at managing Mac OS. But for basics, and Intune will do a very decent job at managing Mac OS. It does a phenomenal job at managing iOS, Android, and as you can only imagine, it is the right tool to manage your Windows endpoints, Windows workstations. All cloud in storage. So this is probably the simplest, right? A lot of customers have storage. A lot of customers have always and will always probably invest in SMB and NFS, where you could go out, reach out, grab a file, bring it in, open it, make changes to it, and save it back. While we would like to think that most of our customers should and are in SharePoint, there's still valid reasons why some customers, while they are investing in SharePoint and they are leveraging SharePoint for sure, but they still need that traditional SMB NFS file share for unstructured data. And instead of having to worry about, buying SANs and buying all that storage and backing it up and making it available and buying more storage and so on and so forth, storage is just a click of a button in Azure, and you get a list of available options. If you want various tiers, if you want storage that's going to be accessible all the time because some application interacts with it full time, or users are just beating up on it all time, you get hot storage or premium storage, and you get it has application support, it's got great scalability, and it's very low latency. If you don't want to spend a lot of money, why should I be paying all that money for storage that I barely use? I just want to use it as an archive. You could definitely go to Cool Storage or Archive Storage, where the cost is a lot lower. Think of it as Microsoft buying the hard drive for you and amortizing it over time. You don't have to manage anything. All you do is put your data up there, and you could still connect to that storage via traditional old protocols. It's backed up for you, and just no worries. You just put it up there and you move on. And finally, automation. So automation for enterprise application integration and B2B logic apps. Logic apps is what we used to think of historically before the birth of Azure and cloud native, is when I automated and orchestrated tasks and integrations between various applications. One thing that comes to mind that we used to do, which we don't really do much of because of logic apps anymore, some of the orchestrations we worked on with something like a BizTalk server. If it was a simple scenario where you needed to integrate applications or get data moving between applications, today logic apps can do that for you. You could grab data from one source, migrate it based on an event or based on a trigger to another source, move data around. All of that automation can happen using logic apps. I like to think of logic apps as the Azure version of the Power Platform, if you will, on M365, where you could automate a lot of business processes over there. On logic apps, you could automate a lot of data migrations and event triggers and actions, based on rules. And then, we're seeing a lot more logic app usage with IoT devices when data is being consumed by appliances that are in the field. When they read something, depending on what it's reading or what the data looks like, logic apps is sitting there in the middle and going, oh, I see that, this appliance out in the field read this number value, and based on that value, I do certain tasks and I move stuff around accordingly. And this is where definitely logic apps are coming in to help our customers. Automation obviously today still happens, but instead of having to manage all of that using traditional on-premises workloads, you could definitely do that using those logic apps up in the cloud and store them up there and let them run up there. Okay, so we'll get to the second half of this, which is, I'd like to call that the elephant in the room, because we're starting to get a lot of requests based on that. So cloud agility, I know this is probably a little bit a step away a little bit from cloud agility per se, but we're going to cover what that means based on VMware. So do I renew or do I not renew? We're not a VMware partner. We're not here to convince our customers one way or the other, but we do know a number of things, right? VMware licensing, there has been price hikes since the Broadcom acquisition. Customers are coming to us and asking us about other options that are outside of VMware, especially in small, medium, mid-market businesses that can no longer afford the hypervisor that is sold by VMware, right? And their licensing model. Of course, as a Microsoft partner, and we will talk about this here in a little bit in the next slide, we're all we could do is take you over to your potential, Microsoft similar platforms that will compete with VMware. That doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other solutions out there. We're seeing we have a lot of partners that are VARs and that are partners of other providers. And, we see, for example, Nutanix jump in there and take on some of these VMware customers that don't want to renew licensing based on, usually for right now, it's price. We're not a Nutanix partner, but I just want to make sure that we're putting out there that there are other options. Here we're going to talk about the Microsoft options. So regarding the Microsoft options, these numbers have been pulled by IDC regarding the return on investment. So this is the return on investment if you take your VMware hypervisor and move it to an Azure solution, which is the Azure VMware solution. IDC suggests that there's a 357% over a 3-year ROI. That includes benefit discounts and commitments. Of course, this is not just all in a black hole. There are a number of things that have to happen for you to achieve this ROI. This number 357 is pretty high, but this is for 100 users. There's a 37% decrease in a 3-year cost for operations when you move those workloads from a VMware hypervisor on premises. Obviously, that takes management, that takes expertise to be able to ensure that hypervisor and all the hosts and everything that's associated with it is up and running. IDC is suggesting a $60,700 over 3 years in savings on staff that's managing VMware on premises, and $38,000 savings over 3 years over infrastructure. That's on average, right? We're not talking enterprise here. We're talking mid-market. To move those workloads over to the cloud, or to move those workloads over from VMware over to let's say Hyper-V or a Microsoft similar platform, you obviously need professional services, and professional services don't necessarily have to mean a partner like ours. It could be internal staff. Regardless, either one, you're using professional services. It's either payroll liability or it's paying a partner like us. The payback on professional service is roughly, on average, 9 months. Within 9 months, once you pay for those professional services and move your workloads over to the Microsoft stack, within 9 months, you pretty much recovered that cost based on the savings that you're realizing up in the destination. 90% less downtime. So these are actually the numbers based on a study of, I think it was 1,000 users per hypervisor or per VMware solution. So it went from 17.5 outages to 6.7 outages once you moved it over to AVS. It went from 6.4 hours to 4.1 hours time to repair on average once you moved it to AVS. And based on these two numbers, if you do the math on the number of users, you went from 5.9 hours of productivity lost based on unplanned outages to 0.6 hours of productivity lost based on unplanned outages. And it's 86% faster deployment. So once you get it, once you move it, once you grab it and move it over to AVS, new deployments, standing up new compute, standing up additional roles, additional infrastructure, or additional additional applications within AVS is actually 86% faster to do once you're up in AVS versus when you were in a traditional on-premises VMware hypervisor. Okay, which one do I choose? What are my options? So there are three options. Three Microsoft alternatives to the VMware story. There's move your VMware on-premises solution over to Azure VMware solution. It is probably the one that's most common as far as customer requests. Why? Because you are still using VMware. You are still using that hypervisor. Your IT resources that are very strong and very familiar with VMware are still going to use the same exact product. The only difference is that there's a bit of a layer here where that product is actually just sitting inside of Azure, and Azure worries about the licensing, or Microsoft worries about the VMware licensing, not you. You just worry about the Microsoft compute cost of this. The beauty of that solution is that this is obviously a relationship between VMware and Microsoft. So there's symmetry, meaning you're going to get the latest and greatest. Whatever VMware you think that you're losing out on because you're no longer in VMware, you're not. Whatever VMware is releasing is showing up in AVS, in Azure VMware solution. You're getting all of it. You're getting vSphere, you're getting HCX, NSX, the vSAN, all of it. You're getting all of it all the time. The beauty of this is that if we go back a few slides here, as you decide to become a little more cloud modernized and start leveraging those microservices within Azure, like app services or whatever, it's a lot easier to integrate because you're already in Azure. And you could just reach out across that cloud ecosystem and start touching these microservices that are out there, like Azure SQL, like Logic apps, right? And slowly but surely, you can move to that microservices model, the all-in model that we talked about earlier. Cost savings, I'm not sure I need to speak to that much, right? I mean, we understand why people are, or some customers, not everybody, but we understand why some mid-market and small customers are moving away from VMware because of their new pricing model. Cost savings are definitely a thing. It's real when you get your workloads up to AVS. And finally, the beauty of this is because in reality, we're almost migrating from VMware to VMware. It's just that it's now sitting in Azure. Migrations from one to the next are extremely rapid. You get up there really quick. It's not a lot of complexity. It's just almost think of it, not really 100%, but think of it as I'm just moving over to a new host, if you will. That host is actually now Azure instead of it being my on-premises infrastructure. So the other alternative for customers that don't necessarily want to go to Azure just yet, and they just kind of want to stay within that on-premises world. I know that's not very popular, but it's Hyper-V, right? I mean, Hyper-V is a competitor. It's a familiar model with the hypervisor model all here. The beauty of Hyper-V is that actually it's a little more sort of cutting edge when it comes to Azure extensibility. It's easier to extend into Azure when you're in Hyper-V. Obviously uses the virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI model. Hyper-V has enhanced security now and leveraged a lot of the security that you see in Azure today. And I know some people would argue this, but in the old days, there always used to be, oh, Hyper-V is just childlike compared to VMware and how advanced VMware was. Very true. Not as true today. The VMware parity is getting closer and closer with Hyper-V. And then finally, cost savings. It's not as expensive as VMware. Now, the disadvantage, I have this highlighted in red for a lot of our customers, is that there is that, I like to call it an emotional attachment. There is that brand loyalty. VMware customers are usually resistant to move to Hyper-V just because of the tribal knowledge that they've developed over the years. And obviously, that is still true today. It's something that customers have to overcome. And if they can't overcome them, obviously, they move to Azure VM solutions. But Hyper-V is the only other alternative to stay on premises for a Microsoft partner like ours, if you're talking to us. And finally, and this is a very small portion of the of our customer base, very small portion that's going to really consider this, and that's the Azure Stack HCI. And what that is, at the end of the day, it's really designed for syndicated providers, the large providers of the world, like a Lumen, who is actually going to give you Azure in a sense, but not by Microsoft. It's actually the Azure product, the Azure ecosystem, sure, but it's not really living in the Azure data center that is owned by Microsoft and managed by Microsoft. And of course, it doesn't have to be. You could actually invest in Azure Stack HCI as a customer, but unless you're an enterprise customer or an extremely large customer, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and I'll get to why, right? But why is there Azure Stack HCI? There is need for Azure Stack HCI when it comes to latency and geo availability. The example I would give is we have a customer that wants to go to Azure, but unfortunately their application, which is a legacy application that they've heavily invested in, they want to move the data source over to Azure, but there is no Azure data center close enough to them, nationally at least, on average, that will be able to accommodate the latency between where their application lives and where the data source, in this case, it's actually SQL, lives. So we can't move them to an Azure data center. We can't grab that data source and move it to San Antonio or Virginia or Tacoma. We can't do that because the latency is too great. This is where a partner like Lumen would come in, or Azure Stack HCI would come in and would say, we will stand up Azure for you somewhere near your location, let's say in Chicago, right? And then now you could leverage Azure Stack HCI. It's your own Azure cloud at the end of the day. The problem with Azure Stack HCI is it's not cheap because you need specific hardware, and Microsoft has a list of approved hardware up there, so you got to invest in that. And then you're going back to the good old managing infrastructure. If you're going to buy the hardware, you have to manage that hardware, and you have to manage that Azure Stack infrastructure, Azure Stack sitting on top of that infrastructure. So now you're kind of doubling your management. So from a cost management perspective, you're not really saving a lot of money, but it's a use case for very specific customers. And finally, when you go to Azure, when you migrate, this is almost a replica of what I just showed earlier. This is the beauty of going to Azure VMware Solutions, is that you could start trickling that new cloud-first model by easily moving your workloads and your applications from AVS, from a traditional infrastructure, over to these microservices, native Azure solutions that we talked about. App services, Azure SQL. It becomes a lot easier as soon as you get up there and you're running Azure VMware Solutions, and you could take your time, right? You could slowly but surely trickle those in over time while your Azure VMware solution is running up there. And with that, I will turn it over back to Andreas for any questions.
Thank you, Joe, for the wonderful presentation. Before we jump into our entities questions, I have a question of my own. You were talking about not being fully in the cloud or not fully migrating to the cloud, which is a hybrid cloud model. What are the potential risks and challenges associated with that model?
From a risk perspective, really none. If you're being thoughtful about how you're going to do this, I mean, anything you do with reckless abandon is going to be a risk, right? But if you're designing this properly there are no risks. I don't see where the risks would come in. The challenge is that it's the transition, meaning as you extend into the cloud yet continue to live on premises, it's like I'd like to compare it. It's like owning two homes, right? You gotta manage both. You gotta clean both. You gotta pay taxes on both. You gotta all of that stuff comes with it. So what you're doing is you have that transition phase. If it is transition, I mean, some people own two homes and they're happy with it. That's fine. But you are now having to invest in ensuring that you continue to be invested and manage that on-premises world that you live in. And now you have a cloud piece that you also have to, it's not as much management, but you can't just, turn a blind eye to it, right? You still have to keep an eye on it and you still have to invest in it. So that's where I think a bit of the challenge comes in, but I don't see risks.
We have a question. How can Cloud Agility improve disaster recovery and business continuity planning?
So this is where ASR comes in, Azure Site Recovery. We're seeing more and more customers now going to ASR. And what they're saying is, so let me talk about the full model. If you are cloud first, if you're already up in the cloud, you're already almost built-in agile or built-in agile from the sense from the disaster recovery sense, because Azure gives you very, very easy access and levers to replicate your workloads across various regions and across, you could scale up and out. They've invested all over the world, right? So that's easy. But for on-premises customers, Azure Site Recovery is really the lowest hanging fruit for disaster recovery up in the cloud. And that's what I talked about earlier, which is I am invested on premises, fine. I want to ensure disaster recovery. Of course you do, but I don't want to invest in more infrastructure. That's where you have to become agile. That's where you can be agile and go, fine, move the disaster recovery over to Azure so that Azure is sitting there at your beck and call in case there's a disaster and it lights up. Now, the planning isn't necessarily rocket science. You have to plan a little bit, right? You have to build in connectivity between your site and Azure. There's a cost to the entry. You have to pay a little bit and invest in infrastructure and architecture to get going. But really, the planning isn't that complex. You're doing the same planning pretty much as if you were standing up on-premises assets for disaster recovery in some data center across some other state, right? You still have to build that connectivity. You still have to build all of the networking to make them look like one. Same.
We've all got phone calls in the last 2-3 years, and especially after the CrowdStrike outage last year, about vendors trying to sell cloud backup licenses outside of Microsoft, like a separate solution. What is your recommendation on that perspective, and should we stay with Microsoft fully, or should we invest in a third-party software?
I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question because our loyalties are to Microsoft and we believe you could fix it all with Microsoft. I know probably a lot of people listening in are going to probably nodding their heads going, this guy's crazy, and that's fine. I am not suggesting that there aren't some phenomenal best of breed solutions out there. I can't speak to them, but I could tell you that for certain scenarios and use cases, Microsoft does offer a good solution for backups. Again, for the majority of use cases. I'm not suggesting for all of them. And I guarantee you that somebody right now is saying, no, there's this that I want to do, and Microsoft can't do it. That's legitimate and that's fair. But for the majority of our customers that are already invested in the Microsoft ecosystem, more times than not, when they provide the use case and the scenario to us, again, more times than not, I'm not saying all the time, the response is, you could do this natively. And of course, if the answer is no, I don't think Microsoft can do that, we're more than happy to refer them to the partner. But we do run into that, but not often.
Another question that we got, what are the best practices for ensuring data security and compliance in a cloud environment?
Yes. So I'm glad this is asked because remember we talked about in the second slide, I believe, I talked about security.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, psychologically, like I said, what we see is most customers feel safe when they're sitting inside the wall and the door's closed. I get that. And it is very true that if you just get your stuff up there and just say, okay, I hope Microsoft is protecting me, that's not the right thing to do. But you have to invest in governance and you have to invest in ensuring preparation before you get to the cloud. It is an investment and it does cost money, but it will pay for itself tenfold as you go on that journey versus you not doing it and then having to recover from some sort of a disaster because of an oversight. So the best practices are whomever your partner is, hopefully it's us, but our recommendation is always invest in governance and governance will include compliance and data security and all of the above to make sure that you're getting there the right way and not just getting there. You have to get there the right way. So if you reach out to any of our AEs or if you reach out to us or any of our partners, we're more than happy to have a governance conversation with you to give you a bit of an insight on what that entails and all of the things we go through and cover during a governance exercise.
And the reason for that is because even though there is Microsoft best practices, but each business is different. So we need to tailor that best practice to their practice specifically and to their industry.
Absolutely. There are no two, not that I know of at least. I don't think we've ever done two governance exercises that were the same, right? No two businesses run the same. And some customers of ours, we will skip half the framework because it does not apply to them, right? And with other customers, we'll be like, oh, we need to spend an extra time on this just one section because it's very relevant to your business. So yeah, absolutely.
The other question we have is how can organizations effectively manage and optimize cloud cost while maintaining agility? I think that might be in our next webinar, so we don't want to give too much details right now.
Yeah, well, that's okay. The reality is, as I mentioned earlier, lifting and shifting, grabbing a traditional workload and moving it to the same exact workload, but being hosted by Microsoft in an Azure data center is not managing cost. It's not. I have never run into, I mean, at least for a CFO, if you ask a CFO, they're never going to agree with you that just grabbing a server and dumping it up in Azure is going to save you money. There's no way. It doesn't happen. The optimizing cloud costs, meaning spending time in the design phase to move your applications and workloads to cloud native. That's where you will realize a lot of savings. And literally, I guarantee you it's a lot. Microsoft, by the way, introduced a long time ago, a lot of our customers are probably aware of this. They introduced reservations where they told customers, look, for the time being, while you're on the path to modernization, if you lease this server, this VM, for 3 years, we will, I think the savings were phenomenal, like 40% savings, right? I don't know. I can't speak right now to what reservations look like today and what the cost savings are. I haven't looked at them in a while. But the reason for that model is because Microsoft knew very well that if you don't lease, if you just rent, it's not cheaper. But they knew that also customers can't just get to Azure modern design overnight, right? There's a lot of work to be done. And they said, fine, move your workload up there, but lease it, don't rent it, and we will save you some money. So the easiest thing to do is use reservations if you just want to move your workload up there in a traditional sense, lift and shift. Don't just move it and rent it, move it and lease it, which is called reservations. But really, the long-term play is you don't want to live in that model indefinitely. You don't want VMs in perpetually up there. You want to get these applications and all of these roles to run on Azure native services, Azure microservices versus just a VM.
And also one of the big thoughts around cost savings is how to utilize the Azure VMs and making sure that you're not overdoing it. And that's maybe our next webinar where we dive more into it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right too, right? Remember, if you paid, you're spot on. If you paid $15,000 for a server, you paid $15,000, right? You're going to use every single kilobyte and every single megabyte of RAM on it, right? In Azure, that's not the case, right? If you go get a 15 gigabyte whatever, right? Servers, something like that's going to melt the polar ice caps, you're going to pay for that whether you're using it or not, and you're going to pay for it month over month. It's not a single cost that you could depreciate over time. It's operating expenses, which nobody likes. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. You have to be thoughtful about sizing.
Yep. All right. I don't believe we have any more questions. As you can see in the slide, we have 2 more webinars around cloud and application. Stay on the lookout for our marketing emails. We'll be sharing the registration link for those webinars later this week. Thank you for joining us and see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.